Hello, welcome to the Broad Review. I'm Josh, and today we are going into part 5 of this 52-week movie challenge. Last week we looked at a film featuring an animal, in which we did An American Tail. And this week we're looking at an early film of a famous actor and actress. Now, last week I kind of intimated that I'd be looking at the Nicholson, Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep kind of back catalogue, and when I started to look at them, two things predominantly came to mind. The first was that these films have been gone over to death because these actors are so big, so famous, and so prolific that there wasn't much meat from a review standpoint to really get my teeth into, because these films have been analysed so much and so gone over with such a fine-tooth comb, and so anything I had to add to that would be slightly misplaced. Second is I wanted a film where, because of the brief I gave myself when I was doing this 52-week challenge, which is comply with the titles in this term that we're doing an early film of a famous actor and actress. The other caveat, with the exception of a later week, will be a film I've never seen before. And part of that also goes into preconceptions, and I really wanted to explore new films, not just films that I'd heard about and always wanted to see, but just films that I had no real expectation for, no real knowledge behind. And the earlier films of famous actors and actresses, whether you're into films or not, do just permeate the social consciousness. And so I went for actors. Firstly, I went for British actors. I thought keeping something a much more homegrown would help me explore the characters that they're playing and also their acting, but also at the same time it meant, in many regards, I could focus on British filmmaking as well, because I know a lot of what I've done has been very American centric so far. 2001: A Space Odyssey, An American Tail, American Graffiti, and American in Paris. 4. I mean, 3 out of 4 of what I've done literally have America in the title, so I wanted to come back home a little bit and focus more on kind of roots. So the first thing I thought is that take very British centric actors, and so the first actors I started looking at were big names and try and look at their early career. So people like Patrick Stewart, Christopher Lee, those kind of elements. And what I realised very early on is that these were largely, very good, very authentic stage actors, and a lot of their earlier stuff, again, I'd had glimpses of and I've seen because of it. So I thought, let's dial down the names up. Famous actors and actors doesn't need to be the most famous. So I decided to go with somebody who's been in the news a little bit lately from a British perspective, and that was Vinnie Jones, who's been in the news because of his wife's death and his very frank taking on of those issues and discussing them. And with Vinnie Jones as well, it was very obvious to chart when he started acting, because one of the caveats to this is an early film. Now, how do we define early? Especially if somebody is a lifelong actor, an early film might literally just be the first film they did, or it might be, if somebody's had a 60-year career, does the first 20 years of their career count as an early film? So I wanted somebody, again, who I could very quickly go, that was an early film. And this was within 2 or 3 years of him starting acting the film that I've picked. It also happened to coincide with another British actor, one of their, I think their second film they ever did, which was Jason Statham. Two men very much known for being British hard men actors, and so I thought, coming back to that and looking at very much not their first films, because I think they both started out in A Lot of Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. Again, another Guy Ritchie film, as is the film I'm about to review. but also they both had careers prior to starting acting. Jason Statham was a model, and Vinnie Jones was a professional footballer. And so it was interesting to kind of see them at the very rawest and the very earliest, because realistically they'd had no acting build up. Most actors had spent their youth acting and honing their ability. These were people basically picked either because of their reputation, because I think Guy Ritchie picked Jason Statham for his looks, but also the fact that he was known to be a little bit of a cockney geezer, and Vinnie Jones was known to be a very hard man on the football pitch, and that very much fed into their casting. But from an acting perspective, they'd had virtually no experience in their very early career. And so that's why I decided to pick the 2000 film directed by Guy Ritchie called Snatch. Now, I was aware of Snatch, and it has other big actors in it. It's got Del Toro in it. It's got Brad Pitt in it, who Brad Pitt is one of his most finest acting performances, I find, to be in the much more smaller, more independent, lower budget films, where he legitimately acts his soul. I think in a lot of later films with Brad Pitt, as you find with many actors like Jeff Goldblum, they've become a sort of caricature of themselves, and you can't really distinguish the actor from the character. But at this point in his career, you can very clearly see that he is truly acting the part he plays. So Snatch, to give you a little bit of a perspective, it mainly centres around two characters called Turkish, played by Jason Statham, and Tommy, and essentially about them and their small criminal empire of gambling, and they're trying to make money quickly, and that very quickly descends into them from going from a position of trying to gain money and trying to advance themselves to simply trying to keep their head above water. It's very much a sort of scattergun plot and very scattergun characterization, of which we have a bouncing from different scenarios that all have interlocking themes, and they all interlock within a wider, larger narrative. But the central character is that played by Turkish, played by Jason Statham, so called because he was I can't remember if it was he was conceived or he was born on a Turkish Airlines flight, but whichever it was, that's why they called him Turkish. And that little colour really starts to build into what this film is about. And this film, if I had to describe it in a sentence, I would say is a sort of gritty, farcical comedy. But it walks a very neat tightrope between farcical comedy and gritty gangster, and you can really see that this is a Guy Ritchie film. It has his stamp on it, in terms of just his writing, the aesthetic of it, the actual way he shoots this piece. It's a very Guy Ritchie style of film, and I'm going to talk about that a little later on. But I think what I need to focus on from this perspective, given that it's the early film of famous actors, actually looking at the acting. And Vinnie Jones and Jason Statham are not necessarily, to be polite, people who are known as award winners when it comes to their acting. Their acting is very much of the people, it's very much there and to the point. And you can really tell, in particular, I would say more with Jason Statham, you can really tell that this is one of his early films, because there are moments of sort of hyperbolic expression. There are moments where you can tell he's acting, that this is a man trying to play somebody else rather than potentially just a misacted scene. It does feel very much like, I'd have to describe it, do you know in ancient Greece times where they used to put faces or masks in front of their own face to depict emotion? It very much felt like that during various points where you would see Jason Statham's face very impassive, and then when it was his turn to act, he would contort his face into whatever emotion he felt like it was, and then once he finished saying his words, he became a sort of glazed figure again. Now that doesn't discredit the acting performance, because obviously Jason Statham, he isn't known for being somebody who gets ultra into his parts, ultra what's it. It's very much Jason Statham plays versions of himself, or he plays whatever character he's there to portray. But because of all the action that generally speaking goes on in a Jason Statham style of film, it often detracts from the character performance, which is peculiar, because when you flip the tables slightly and we look at the main actor who I'd looked at in terms of his early film work, which was Vinnie Jones, he's the mirror image. This is a man who really felt real when it was acting. Now, whether that's a case of this is Vinnie Jones playing as close to Vinnie Jones as possible, or whether this is him truly recognising some kind of acting potential, Vinnie Jones was brilliant in this piece. You got the sort of psychotic aggression, but there was also undercurrents of other emotions. Now, he plays, I think the character was called Bullet Tooth. There was a lot of characters in this, and it's really hard to define them and separate them, but he was basically someone who was shot 6 times, melted them down into bullets for teeth from the bullets, and he essentially became a man during this piece who was utilised as a fixer or a finder. He could find anybody for you. And throughout this piece, it gets very farcical once Vinnie Jones gets involved, because through that vehicle of Vinnie helping this American man hunt down a jewel, he ends up connecting a lot of the plots, and by doing that it becomes very abstract, where they walk in certain scenarios, like they walk in on a man trying to dispose of a dead body, or they walk in on, or they are immediately precede much more farcical events. And so Vinny is a kind of almost straight guy, but at the same time also a nutter, somebody who you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of. He walks a very fine line between humorous and intimidating. And in Snatch, there's a particular scene that really just really embodies this moment. And it's when we're first introduced to Forte. They have a little flashback montage of him in this strip club getting shot, and then they cut to deciding to phone this man up. Now his car phone, which tells you how old this is, his car phone starts to ring whilst he's smashing somebody's head into a car door. And obviously the audience, first an automatic reaction is, this man is getting his skull pounded in, this must be a maniac. And then the kind of levity with which he then answers the phone really tells us something. I think that's really a sort of microcosm of Snatch, which is, it's dark, it's gritty, but it uses almost a sort of humorous realism to undercut it. Because that idea of having extreme emotion and then going to answer your phone to be perfectly polite, perfectly amiable, is, I think, a situation we can all identify. Not to that extreme, but I know there's been circumstances where I've been angry and annoyed and the phone's rung, and suddenly my mood's completely changed, because you have to answer the phone, you have to answer it nicely. And it was just that slight levity that's connected to the sort of, connected us as human beings in our own normal, non-crazed gangster life to their life as well. And so, from the chief person I was focusing on, Vinnie Jones, I've got to say, as an early piece of his acting career, this was phenomenal, and I think it was a stellar performance from him. Now obviously he isn't the main character, so she comes to him halfway through, so maybe given something more meaty, he might have faced problems that potentially Jason Statham did during the course of this film. But there was a genuine sort of humanity to this character. Even though he was this hard man, even though he was this man who would beat anybody he wanted up, there was a sort of softness undercutting it. And I've got to applaud Guy Ritchie, largely speaking, on the cast that he managed to assemble, because you can see a lot of British talent, and it's one of those films where almost every other person is, oh, it's that guy from such and such a film, or it's that guy who played so and so. There was a lot of that recognition of a lot of very talented British actors really coming together. What I would say, moving away slightly from the acting perspective, looking at the plot, is it felt very disjointed to begin with. Guy Ritchie has a very unique style of shooting and acting where he deliberately has sort of blurs and shakes and certain off-kilter camera angles to kind of disorient it. And that, coupled with such a scattergun plot where really very early on we are introduced to about 10 characters, 10 to 20 actually, it's much more than 10, in very, very rapid succession, and expected to take this information in. But what I've got to say is, over the course of the hour and 45 film, is that fundamentally all the characters felt relevant, even though early on it was very much disjointed and very much kind of overwhelming from an audience perspective to try and keep on top of it. Once you did keep on top of it, and it only took about 30 minutes to really start to get into who these characters were and what context they existed in, it felt familiar. I've got to say, in the most, and this might sound to some people a little bit like criticism, but it's really not, it felt television. It felt like these were characters that we'd known for a while. It felt slightly soap opera in the sense that it felt like almost these characters had been established before we'd started watching. That we knew who these people were despite the speed with which we get introduced to them. They're given those snapshots of humanity mixed in with madness that helps us know who those characters are. And that first half hour to an hour, which realistically is a lot of setup, does a very, very good job of teaching us about who these characters are, because once we get into that frame of mind where it's almost like the first half an hour to an hour of the film is like somebody setting up a chessboard, getting the pieces in the right place, lining them up, giving their position, kind of familiarise ourselves with the rules, which piece does which, and after that first half hour to an hour, right, we're going to start playing this game now. And it felt very much like that. It gave a lot of time to help us establish these characters, but at the same time establish events. And what I've got to say is, I never really thought about Guy Ritchie as a writer. I know him as a director, and I know him as somebody who has a very unique style of direction. I knew his mark as soon as I saw certain angles. I went, let me just check who's this directed by, and it was directed by Guy Ritchie. And so it had his unique stamp, and obviously this is very early in his directorial career, and so there was a lot of almost experimental aspects to the camera work, or it certainly would have been viewed like that at the time. But those aspects that then transition into later films, such as the Sherlock Holmes films that he later did, and also I think as well he directed Aladdin. It looks slightly disjointed when you have it in that world of Aladdin where it's that remake and they try and keep it as much original. You can see there's certain elements of Guy Ritchie which he just tried to sneak into his film later on, but it just didn't quite work within that context. But you can see sort of that maker's mark, or even this film being that forge with which he started to make his mark, stamped all the way through it. But when I looked at him in terms of a writer, he had really interesting way of writing, and I've got to say, I probably misjudged how talented he really is, because he has a really succinct and brilliant way of bringing out character details through exposition. And there are lots of moments where he's telling us about, or setting up events, or telling us about what's going to be happening next, who a certain man is. And he does so in a really succinct and brilliant way of both visually telling us about the story, telling us about a character to be introduced, while at the same time telling us about the character who's doing the talking. And I think in the hands of any other kind of writer, this kind of film might have failed, simply on the basis of the amount of characters he's packed in. But he made the environment we dropped ourselves in feel real and feel unique. But it also didn't feel closed either. It felt like there was lots of little communities within the world of this film. Often when you create a world in fiction, it feels closed off. It feels like a village. Take, for example, now this is going to seem slightly out there, but take J.K. Rowling, for example, in her Harry Potter franchise. When you see her introduce the wizarding world and all these characters, we get a lot of depth to those characters, but they also feel like they all live within a very small community. Everybody seems to know each other, everybody seems to fit. But in Snatch, there's a lot of disjointed tangents, there's a lot of kind of gaps, as you would, and we don't get that explanation early on, so it's there for the audience to start figuring out where these tangible connections come from, how certain characters fit to other certain characters. And it was very deliberately done in a very disjointed ways to keep the audience thinking whilst it's doing its groundwork, while it's setting those foundations up for the characterization, while it's setting up the plot. Now the plot itself isn't brilliant because this is very much a sort of exploration of a world and exploration of certain characters. Now although I've talked about the way he set up the characters and the characterization is good, because it's so many characters, there are certain surface level tension, surface level water, but that isn't an issue in a film like this, because this is about introducing the audience to this new world which they aren't aware of and giving them those tangible connections. So it doesn't matter that you have relatively stereotypical versions of certain characters, because he manages to just dig just enough, slightly below stereotype, slightly below the surface, to give us a taste of those characters. So for example, there's a character played by, can't remember his name, but he plays Frank Butcher in EastEnders. Now this man is a diamond merchant, and it could have been very easy for this man to have just been Jewish. Make him Jewish, and then we could stereotypically implant a lot of virtues onto this man. But Guy Ritchie in his writing just dug a little further below the surface and decided that this man was from the East End. He wasn't Jewish, but he pretended to be Jewish because it helped business. And that's just one of those little tweaks to a character that just gives us lots of little information about him. This is a man who wants to be stereotyped. He wants people to associate a certain business acumen to him. That this is a man who will do whatever it takes to be good at business. That tells us a lot about the character very quickly through very minor details. And he does this for a lot of characters throughout, like just peppers seemingly random detail, but it really tells us about the background, like the fact that Tommy tells people his parents named him after a Tommy gun, which is rubbish. But it tells us everything we need to know about Tommy's character. And then we get those little occasions where we get to reinforce the idea behind the fact that this guy is very self-conscious. And we get certain little resolutions, rather, not revelations, resolutions to those problems. And so we get those sort of very micro arcs for each of these characters. But because there's so many characters, it feels overwhelming within the context of the film that we get so much detail from these people. And kind of going a little bit further than that, we end up with quite a nice understanding of who we are and who these people are and how they're going to react. And I think it would be remiss not to talk about Brad Pitt and his portrayal of a gypsy, which is hilarious. Because it's Brad Pitt, and the kind of films and kind of characters that we've seen him play are very, very distinct from the character we have during this film. But also the fact that there's a lot of emotion behind the character, and you realise why this actor is so big when you see his reaction to his mother being burnt in a caravan. It just connects you almost viscerally with who he is, and it was necessary within the context of, because it then sets up the ending, because it then sets up the double cross and why there was a double cross. And it also helps us as an audience start to wonder, was the double cross always there, or was it the fact that the sort of mob boss decided to kill his mother that decided to make him double cross him? And so it was really interesting from that perspective to explore those kind of characters. And I think in equal part, all the actors within this film were both aspects of menacing and aspects of comic relief, and that really fed into the realism of the characters. I think often you can find you end up with a piece where there's one or two characters who are just humorous or just comical. Maybe give them a little bit of fleshing out, so the reason that they're comical is because they were bullied or XYZ, but we often find that they're wholly one thing or wholly the other, with just a slight variation of characters at certain times to kind of try and get some degree of emotional response. But in Snatch it's really earned because we see humorous sides of all the characters, but it's also humour within the context of their situation and who they are. So for example, the mob boss walks in on a dead body, and then we have a really humorous scene of him basically describing how he would get rid of the body, but it's situational comedy because of these people not knowing really who he is, why he's here, but allowing him to come in, sit down, start describing how he gets away with the body. And then we immediately juxtapose that, because when he leaves, it's automatically a case of, right, we're going to put you guys in a body bag as well now. Going from a plot perspective though, obviously when you look at it solely within terms of plot, it's a very run-of-the-mill plot. Somebody's got a diamond, they're trying to get the diamond, and the diamond keeps changing hands. That's about it from a plot perspective, which is why this film works, because it's so simple and linear that you can draw off lots of lines from where to introduce those characters. And I think if this film had focused on less characters, the plot would have had to been significantly better and significantly more outstretched, because there are moments where I think we as an audience, only for the first half an hour, and I think deliberately, don't really know where we're going. I'm not really sure what's happening, and obviously, as I've said, this is very much an exploration of a certain world and of certain characters, but it's done to really good effect. And so when it comes to Snatch, it's difficult to place it because there are faults, but those faults almost seem deliberate. Obviously, as I've already mentioned, there's certain acting performances from the actors which just do not work. The fact that Jason Statham, I don't like him as an actor, and he's still acting, and this film's success may play a role in that, might discolour my opinion of the film. But what I've got to say in terms of critique, and there are critiques, is that I think there's times when the film tries slightly too much to be too clever, and it goes against itself, because the film tries to set itself up as being a little bit of a twist ending, with the gypsy played by Brad Pitt robbing all the money. when for me it was very blatantly obvious that this gypsy wouldn't be playing by the rules. The fact that he'd already knocked somebody out by technical knockout, which firstly doesn't compute with the character's responses, because the mafia boss should have just killed him there and then, instead of giving him another chance. It just didn't fit with the character that had been established, and then going over the same thing again and again expecting a different result. But it also then goes onto sort of slightly Deus Ex Machina. Not entirely, because it's not like there's an occurrence of anything, but it felt ultra resolved ultra quickly without anything else really to help us out within the context of the film. We were building to a certain moment, and it didn't really feel like the crescendo, the climax ever got there. It just felt a little flat towards the end. And it tries to give us a sort of cheek and charm ending with Turkish and Tommy getting the dog, which has ended up swallowing the jewel, and kind of almost that sort of Del Boy-esque, oh, we'll win out the deal, we'll get the money, this time next year we'll be millionaires. But it just didn't quite stick the landing. And I think that is the ultimate criticism of this film, is that it has to be likened to the gymnastic routine. There was lots of tricks, lots of flips in the air, lots of things to ooh and ah and be impressed about, but it just didn't stick the landing. So that's some questionable acting choices, not just from Jason Statham, but he's the main culprit. Occasionally getting slightly disorientated early on. Now, I say that was a deliberate choice, but it was a choice which I don't think necessarily worked in the film's favour. I think Snatch is one of those films where if you were so inclined to turn off after half an hour, it would be very easy to understand why. I potentially could have very easily gone after half an hour, this isn't for me. And it's only really once you get past the hour mark that you can oh, we're settled in now, we're invested. And it's really one of those films that you have to invest your time and your effort into watching. Because, and I think that goes to show the nature of how filmmaking has changed, because of the way that we consume media now compared to 20 years ago. When you went to the cinema, you were locked in, essentially, for however long the film was. So you had time to not really enjoy the opening, to then enjoy this main course that was fed up, and it's such a fabulous main course it was. And there's actors and characters I've not even touched on, but who were hilarious. I'm thinking in particular of the scene where a gang was hired to rob a bookies, only for, firstly, the person running the bookies not to care that they were trying to rob, second, not having any money on them, and third, them then getting locked in the bookie shop, not being able to get out. It was just a hilarious little scene and a hilarious aspect to the film, but it really added a lot of extra dimensions onto it. And I say there's moments where I keep calling this slightly farcical comedy at time, and it is, but it's farce through the sort of lens of realism, because I could easily see, and news stories appear all the time of robbers basically being bad at being robbers, and so through that prism you kind of go, actually there's elements of realism here, despite how farcical it might seem within the context of this film and what's going on. And as I've said many times, but it needs to be said, the way it manages to walk that tightrope between comedy and sort of crime, gritty gangster thriller is phenomenal, and the way it bounces between the two and incorporates the two as a single medium is really, really well executed. But there are often, as I've said, elements which just don't work within this film, and it's certainly a film I'd watch again. Without a shadow of a doubt, I would watch this film again. It just has so much to be enjoyed, and it really has a sort of hallmark of a late 90s, early 90s British comedy film. And it's got the sort of Cornetto trilogy style of genre mixing, for the lack of a better word. The way that you had Hot Fuzz incorporate police thrillers with comedy, or zombie movie with comedy. This very much felt like the sort of gangster equivalent of the Nick Frost and Simon Pegg kind of work, without it really falling from one to the other. It had a grittier edge to it, that much is true, but I think it's hard not to watch films like Shaun of the Dead, like Hot Fuzz, and go, that's not gritty. It is, it's got lots of gritty moments. And so I would say, for me, it's got that sort of genre mixing British element which really works in its favour. There's obviously a lot of issues, as I've discussed, but largely speaking, I think this is a film that works well and is successful. So from my perspective, because of all those elements which come together and work so well together, I'd have to give it 4 stars out of 5. And I know that's probably my most common rating, but it's a well-deserved one. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening to the Broad Review, for anybody who is out there listening. Next week, with Challenge 6, I'll be doing a film with subtitles. Now, what that actually means, I'm not entirely sure, because most films have subtitles, or have the ability to have subtitles. If it's a case of subtitles incorporated within the main plot, normally that means foreign language, but I know there's a category later on for a foreign language film. It won't be silent film, because there's another category for that. And if it's just a film that has subtitles occasionally in it, it seems a peculiar request to go, I want you to watch a film which has some subtitles at some point in it. So while I get to grips with that over the next week of what it's actually asking, and decide which film I'm going to incorporate with that, I want to thank you all, whoever you are, wherever you are, for watching, you're not watching, you're looking at a black screen. Thank you all for listening. I've been Josh, see you next time.